Hi guys, and welcome to our second video on the Middle Ages revision. So today we're going to look at the Lord and the Lady of the Castle. So again, the Middle Ages we're looking at the time period from 500 CE to 1500 CE. So in moving forward with our keywords, I've divided up the lives of the Lord and Lady into 5 sections. So the first section is about the Lord and his duties. The second section is about the Lady and her duties. The third section is looking at the rooms of their castle, which is where they lived. The fourth section is looking at the parts of the castle. And the fifth section is looking at the entertainment, food, and pastimes of the Lord and the Lady. Again, looking at feudalism, where the Lord fits into our triangle. So above the Lord would be the king. But in our little triangle we have here, we see the Lord's on top. Below him is like a lower lord or a vassal. And then underneath that is the knights and the serfs. So the king would give land, which was called the fief, to the Lord. And in return, he would pledge loyalty or fealty to the king. So now we're going to look at some of the duties of the Lord. The first thing he was he was a judge. So the Lord would be the judge for any disputes in his territory. The courtroom would take place in the Great Hall. And any disputes would usually be sat in the morning, and the Lord was act as a judge. He also gave permission for people to marry. Another duty of the Lord was that he was a money collector or a tax collector. So all the peasants who worked on the Lord's lands had to pay him rents or taxes, and they had to pay fines to him as well. Especially if you were brought in front of the court, you had to pay a fine. That money was due and owed to the Lord. A lot of times the peasants wouldn't have had money, so they would have paid in kind. What I mean by paying in kind is they would have paid like a portion of the food that they grew on their lands. And we'll look at that in more detail when we look at peasants. Now we'll look at a few people who worked for the Lord. And specifically, we're going to look at the steward. So he was in charge of the king's estate. He was like his right-hand man. So any day-to-day running of the business of the Lord would be done by the steward. Another important person is the bailiff. So bailiffs were in charge of collecting taxes, and they made sure that the criminals were brought to court. Now, on to the duties of a lady. So the key words we're looking at here are domestic duties, education, ladies in waiting, and medicine. So, first of all, the ladies were in charge of domestic duties. So that means they were in charge of the house. So they made sure that the storeroom was full. They made sure that the house was running properly. The second aspect of a lady's duties was when the Lord was away from the castle, she was in charge. It didn't go to the steward or it didn't go to anybody else. She was in charge, and she made these decisions, and she would be making decisions in court rulings and all of these things. She was in charge. So the third aspect of a lady's duties were she would be in charge of educating young noblewomen. So young noblewomen would be sent to a neighbouring castle to be educated by the lady of the house from the age of 7. The lady would be helped in this by her ladies in waiting. So these would be women of noble birth, possibly usually family, who would be with the lady and help her in her duties. Ladies would also mix medicine using herbs if there was no doctor available. They'd be the people you would go to if you were sick and there was no doctor around. You would go to the lady of the manor. So moving away now from the lords and the ladies, we're going to look at the rooms of the castle. So the rooms we're looking at are the solar, the bedchambers, the guardrobe, the great hall, a spiral staircase, the guard room, the kitchen, the dungeon, and the storehouse, or cellar as it's sometimes called. So what was the solar? So this was the section of the house that contained the Lord and Lady's private rooms. So it was always at the top, on the top floor of the castle. And within here you'd have the bedchambers, you would have the day room where a lady might do embroidery or sewing, and you'd have the guardrobe, which was the medieval toilet. Beneath the solar you would have the great hall. So this was usually on the middle floor, and this is where important feasts were held and where important meetings were held. And as we said earlier on, this is where court cases would happen also. Below the Great Hall, you would have the the guard room. So this is where soldiers. This picture here is actually of old guard room. This is where the knights and the guards would sit, waiting to be called upon. Beside that, on the same level, you'd also have the kitchen where the food was prepared for the feasts. And underneath these, at the lowest level, you would have the dungeons and you'd have the storehouses. So the storehouses were where the food was kept, and beside that would be the dungeons. And the dungeons would look. This was a picture of an actual dungeon, and you can see the chains hanging from the wall, and people would be stuck down in these dungeons. Spiral staircases were another aspect of the building of the building that was the castle or the keep, and these were designed to get from one floor to the next, and they were purposely made narrow and designed in this way so that it was easier to attack coming down the stairs, because your right hand would be able to attack. Most people who are right-handed, so that's why the staircases are narrow and in that spiral design. The next thing we're going to look at is the parts of the castle. So our keywords here are keep, drawbridge, battlements, watchtowers or turrets, a moat, curtain or high walls, a barbican, also known as a gatehouse, a portcullis, and narrow slit windows. So this is a very basic diagram of a castle. And in the middle we have the keep. So that is the name of the castle where we just saw where all those rooms were. That's the main living quarters of the lord or lady. And all the rooms we looked at would have been contained within the keep. Around the keep you can see there's a moat. So this was a big ditch filled with water, so it would be difficult to make it more difficult for anybody to attack. Then you had a drawbridge which would come down over the moat to allow people to leave, and you pull it up and it would be hard then to attack the walls. You couldn't push a siege tower up if the moat was there. Then we had the high walls, and on top of the high walls is an area called the battlements, and that is where the soldiers or the knights could walk along from tower to tower. So these towers, these watchtowers, are also known as turrets, and they would be kind of towers that came out of the building. Another thing you'd have at the drawbridge, there was the barbican or the gatehouse. You can see the arrow here pointing to the barbican. And then they'd have this thing called the portcullis, which was these sharp spikes, and that would drop down very quickly. If there was attack coming, that would drop down. It was made of steel. This is where you generally see a battering ram being used against a portcullis or something like that, trying to take that down. And the final feature of the castle that we're going to talk about is the narrow slit windows. And this was specifically designed so that an archer inside the building would be able to shoot out, and he wouldn't be able to get shot at himself. Finally, our fifth part of the presentation is entertainment, food, and pastimes. So our keywords here again are banquets, platters, trenchers, pottage, bard or a minstrel, a troubadour, hunting, hawking, embroidery, and sewing. So what was a banquet? So banquets were dinner parties that were held in the Great Hall, and there was entertainment put on for all the guests that were there. This is a picture from the time showing what it might look like. You can see in the background there's knights providing entertainment to the men who were standing around and had kind of like a buffet on the table. Now, what they ate out of, the two most common types of cutlery are to be found at a banquet were platters and trenchers. So platters were like silver plates, and the lord and those tables closest to the lord's table would usually get platters. But as you got further away from there wasn't enough platters to go around, so those other people would get things called trenchers. And these were plates that were made of stale bread, and you'd literally put the food in this stale bread kind of container. One of the types of food you put in that would be pottage. That's a type of medieval stew. Again, if you could mention that in a people in history question, that would be very impressive to an examiner. Other types of food they ate goose and they ate pheasants. These would have been very popular foods at the time. Sources of entertainment at these banquets would have come from people like bards or minstrels. So a bard or a minstrel was the musician who lived at the court. So he would have lived there at the court, and that was his job. That's where he stayed. And then we had these guys called troubadours, and these were more like traveling musicians who move from town to town and they get paid for their services. And the final thing we're going to look at is the other pastimes. So hunting was popular pastime among lords at the time. Hawking was also popular, but it was probably more popular among ladies, as this required a bird of prey, a hawk or another bird of prey, would sit on your hand, and they would go off and they would hunt smaller birds, or they'd hunt rabbits or mice or stuff like that. Another pastime for ladies at the time was sewing and embroidery. We talked about earlier on the day room, and they would have employed sewing and embroidery in these rooms. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive list of everything. This is, as I said, a revision video. Hopefully, this will reintroduce you guys to a lot of those key terms that you guys would have encountered 2 years ago, and we'll work on them in class tomorrow. Okay.